Well, thanks for joining us today on the Big Blue Podcast. This is Greg Stone, Metro Campus Provost, here as always with our President, Dr. Leigh Goodson. Good afternoon, Dr. Goodson.
How you doing?
I'm well for recording on a Friday afternoon, and we are here with Dr. Phil Smith, who is one of our assistant professors of history at the Metro Campus. And Phil, thank you for your time coming in, too. We're really excited talking about Phil's new book, From Prague to Prague, Czechs in an Oklahoma Farm Town. And it's exciting to not just say your book, but your new book, insinuating there is an old book, which I have a copy of right here, which maybe we can talk about in a minute too, which I've read and is really good. But congratulations!
Well, thank you
on the new book. That's really exciting. We were just talking a minute ago about this book. Really was based on your dissertation research.
Yes.
How did you become interested in this topic? I mean, I think most people, hear of Prague, Oklahoma, and don't really think about the connection to the now Czech Republic. But how did you come about this topic to begin with your dissertation research, let alone to get it to a monograph?
Well, it kind of goes back a long time ago. I had graduated from undergraduate college at Northeastern in Tahlequah and decided to join the military. I'd always wanted to be in the military. And so I joined the military, and they asked me if I would be a linguist. And so I went through a battery of exams, and they said, which two languages would you like to request? So I wrote down Russian and Spanish. And so when I got my orders, I was going to language school for Czech. So I spent 13 months in Monterey, California at the Defense Language Institute studying Czech. So when I got out of the military, I worked for quite a while and decided to go to graduate school using my GI money. And I wanted to be a U.S. historian. So I went to the University of Tulsa, and they said, well, we pretty much demand that you use your language in your research. And they said, well, what you need to do is specialize in immigration, assimilation, ethnic identity. So I did so. So I wrote my master's thesis, which was a qualitative work on Czech immigration. So then when I went to OSU, Oklahoma State, for my PhD, they said pretty much the same thing. We'd like you to use your language in your research. So once again, I was not strapped because by then I knew quite a bit about it and enjoyed it. So I decided to write my dissertation on an Oklahoma town. I actually wanted to do it on UConn, but couldn't get access to their material. So I talked to the people in Prague at the Bohemian Hall, and they opened their doors and helped me a lot, showed me all of their old records. If I could add one more thing, it was kind of funny the first time I went there. I went into the Bohemian Hall with these two elderly gentlemen who were officers, and they took me upstairs, and I'm not exaggerating, to this dust-covered wooden file cabinets. And they opened them up, and they said, nobody's looked at these in years because it's written in Czech. And they said, they asked me if you're aware of that, and I said, no, I wasn't, but that's okay because I can read Czech. So that kind of opened up the doors
nice.
For it.
Mm-hmm. That's impressive. Mm-hmm. So that's really interesting how you came to this area of research. And I used to live in western Kansas, and not everybody, but I lived in Hays. I lived in Hays and Russell and Hill City, which Hill City's named because it's on a hill, because everything's pretty flat out there. But many of the people there spoke both German and English. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was really very common, and so it sounds like that's a similar experience that maybe you've had. And you talk about near the 20th century, you write that thousands of Czechs left their homelands in Bohemia and Moravia to immigrate to the U.S. Remind us of what was happening in Eastern Europe at that time, and explain why so many Czech immigrants chose Oklahoma as a destination.
Well, in immigration, there's always two factors why people leave. One is a push factor and one's a pull factor, and both were in evidence during this time. Now, the Czechs are considered part of what is known as the new immigration, which began around late 1870s and went until World War I. However, a lot of them actually came earlier, and the reason is because they were Bohemia and Moravia are the two homelands of the Czechs. They were controlled by the Austrian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, out of Vienna. So they had a lot of close relationships with Germans. And being located in Central Europe, the Austrians chose the Czechs, especially Bohemia, as an area to industrialize. So what you have is you have this big cultural change from an agricultural society to an industrial society. So you have a lot of displaced people going from rural to urban. And at the same time, you have the American Industrial Revolution, and they're actually advertising with pamphlets and posters to come to America. And so a lot of Czechs, Bohemians, started coming to America during this time, quite simply for land. They wanted land. There was not much land left in Bohemia or Moravia, so they came here.
So just as a follow-up, were the flyers advertising the land that was available, or were they advertising the work that
They're
was
advertising jobs.
Right.
Is what they're advertising. Now, once
Okay.
they came here, Czechs, unlike a lot of Poles and other Eastern Europes, you mentioned Eastern Europeans. Now, Czechs would consider themselves Central Europeans. So they actually moved west, and that has to do with their German affiliation. A lot of Germans moved west, and so
Right.
they felt quite at home with the Germans. Although it's interesting because it's kind of a love-hate relationship. They really didn't like the Germans' political control, but culturally they affiliated with them really much more than they did the Slovaks or the Poles or the Bulgarians, those people. Now, you mentioned Oklahoma. The Oklahoma was quite simple. I did a lot of work on the census records, and pretty much all of the people that came, the Czechs that came to Oklahoma, had already been here earlier. They were immigrants, but they had already been to another state, primarily places like Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, Wisconsin, or the Dakotas. And what lured them to Oklahoma was the land runs.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, most of us probably know Prague only because we've seen the sign for it down the Turner Turnpike. I mean, surely sometime in my life I've driven through or been driven through by somebody, but I don't really know anything about it. How did that community come about? And I assume there's a land run connection
Yes.
to it.
It was advertised in the newspapers about, there was more than one land run. The land run that I focus on is the Sac and Fox Reservation, 1893. And it's really quite simple. A lot of people gathered in the Oklahoma City area prior to the land run, and I mean several months early. And it was their language that drew these people together. And in Oklahoma City, before the land run, about 30 families of Czech immigrants decided that when the land run came, they would all cluster together and try to stake out claims, which is what they did. Now, they weren't totally successful because some people had faster horses and wagons, but if you look at the original plats, most of those 30-odd families are fairly close to each other, with an Anglo family or a German family interspersed between them. But that's why they were together, and it was a very much a Czech immigrant farming community until the city, until the town.
When was the town founded?
The town was founded in 1902,
Okay.
and it was founded because the Fort Smith and Western Railroad Company was laying track from Fort Smith, Arkansas, to the Oklahoma City Guthrie area, and they wanted a coaling station. And so they talked a Czech family named Barta into selling some of their land for the coaling station, and that's what became Prague, Oklahoma.
So there are a lot of Czech families in Kansas and Nebraska also.
Yes.
Yes, right. Interesting. I'm Leigh Goodson here with my co-host Greg Stone, and you're listening to the Big Blue Podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Phil Smith, and we've been talking about his newly published book, From Praha to Prague, Czechs in the Oklahoma Farm Town. So tell us, who are some of the figures that you write about in your book, and are there any major personalities or players who were integral to the Czech migration to Oklahoma and the founding of Prague? And let me just say, when I think of Prague, I think of the Infant Jesus, right? Is that
Right.
Yeah.
That
so
sign along the highway.
so
yeah.
there, maybe you have a story about that too, maybe not. But can you talk to us about some of the primary personalities that got the community started?
Yes. And again, there were 30-something families. Now, once Prague was formed, and I can go ahead and tell you the quick story about that, is the people that the primary farmstead, and it wasn't the only one, but the primary one was owned by a family called Barta, B-A-R-T-A, and they were Bohemian, they were Czech. And the Fort Smith and Western Company allowed the matriarch, whose name was Josephine Barta, to name the town. They said, we'll let you name the town. And she gave it the name Praha, because that's the Czech word for Praha in Bohemia, which is where she was originally from. Well, another influential man who owned the store in the area, his name was Frank Vlasek. Frank Vlasek, when he heard about it, went and actually talked to Josephine, and he said, why don't we Americanize it? So they Americanized it to Prague, but that quickly became changed, or I guess Americanized or Oklahomaized, to Prague, and that's how the name came about. And interesting, before when it was just a farming community, the area was actually called Barta Post Office, because they put the post office there first, and just a few, like I say, Frank Vlasek had a store, but the area was called Barta Post Office. And then it became Praha, and then quickly became Prague, and then Prague. A couple of others that were influential there was there was a fellow by the name of Cyril Sadlow, and he has a long history, not just him but his future generations. Sadlow was a cobbler. He ran a local leather store and made people's shoes, but he also was an officer in Bohemian Hall, which was their ethnic fraternal organization, and also I might add their free thought organization. A lot of the Czechs had broken away from the Catholic Church and formed a free thought. Now a lot of them were still there, so the community was split, but it seemed to be an amicable split between the free thought people who had the Bohemian Hall, who had their own cemetery, it's still there, and the Catholic cemetery.
Well, I kind of want to ask you about that dual split, because I haven't read the book yet, looking forward to getting it and reading it, but I know that you write about that sort of sense of dual identity between being very proud to be American, but also very proud of their Czech heritage, and then even those splits further, like you suggest here, in terms of that free thought movement versus the church. I mean, how's that struggle played out in the city of Prague? If we go to Prague now, do we see evidence of sort of that dual identity still, or has that sort of been lost over the last century or so?
No, there's still a dual identity, although it's without a doubt they're completely Americanized. But even today, they still, in fact, they don't call themselves Czechs, and neither do the people. If you go to Prague, they call everyone Bohemians. It's just the old term Bohemian. You will rarely hear the word Czech in Prague, Oklahoma. But it's still there, but they're definitely Americanized. I mean, they no longer run their Czech school. They still have the cemetery. They still have over 300 members in their Bohemian Hall. They meet once a month, but they don't have language classes anymore. There are still a few people that can speak the language, but not that many. They quit the language classes, the best I could find out, in the mid-1970s. So it's definitely disappearing. But there are still some older people that can still speak the language. But they still proudly consider themselves Bohemians, but just as proudly consider themselves Americans.
And a big kolache festival,
Yes.
I assume, still?
Yes.
Yeah.
The kolache festival is the first Saturday of each May, and they still have a Bohemian queen, and they have a junior queen, and you have to have some type of Czech ancestry to enter. It used to be it was half. Now they've changed that. Now if you can just trace someone in your background to that, they have booths. They sell the little cakes, the kolache cakes, and the knedlíky and the brambori, which is potato salad. So they still do that, and they have a big street dance at night, and they bring in a Czech band to play the traditional, and of course, by the night, they're playing more for the young people.
Yeah.
But they have a Czech band that comes in.
I think those small town traditions are really special. It's nice when those kinds of things still, happen.
Yeah. And I might add,
Throughout the
they
years.
still dress up, not all of them, but a lot of them will still dress up in traditional apparel.
Nice.
Do you go?
I have not been. I'll just be honest with you.
But in your research, you learned a lot about what
I
they
learned
did.
a lot about it and
Yeah.
talked to a lot
That's
of them.
pretty
and seen a
exciting.
lot of photographs of it.
So you've already written, as Dr. Stone mentioned before, you've already written a book before. So can you talk to us? And that wasn't that long ago. You, this was published in, Then Sings My Soul, was published in 14? Is
Yes,
that right?
2014.
How different from an experience was it to write that, which it's a fiction book, to writing your newest book? Talk to us about the difference in those two experiences.
Well, I am a historian by training and by nature. So when I wrote Then Sings My Soul, I really wrote it about my childhood, but went farther back. I ended up going farther back. It's historically accurate as far as the setting. So if you read it, it's about Tulsa in 1951, and it's specifically focused on the west side of Tulsa, the working class side, which is where I grew up. I grew up in a community that's, for the first half of my childhood, which is pretty much disappearing now. It's called Garden City. It's the Holly Refinery is slowly buying it up as much as they can, but I grew up in a 3-room house. There were 5 of us, and we all slept in the same bedroom. So I grew up quite poor. Anyway, I wanted to write about that, so I really wanted to make everything accurate about the stores and the people as much as I could. But it is fictional. I did interview over 24 elderly people that lived on the west side and had lived there most of their life, just to get a flavor of it. But the main characters are fictional.
There's so much history in West Tulsa, too, and all of the smaller communities, Red Fork, Carbondale, and they all blend together now, but it's really pretty impressive how loyal West Tulsans are
Yes.
to their roots, and so that's very exciting.
Well, I would say, too, if somebody's looking for a good book to read, I bought the book and read it, really enjoyed reading it. My mom loves historical fiction, passed it on to her. She enjoyed reading it. So it's a good family drama. And,
Well, thanks.
as you said, descriptions of Lookout Mountain and the Frisco Rail Yard. And there's a lot that's changed and gone, like you said, because of the refinery. But there are still landmarks that are very identifiable if you've driven through or lived in or from that part of Tulsa. So we just have a minute or two left, Phil, but I will ask you the question we ask everybody who sits down, which is, if you could go back and give your 18-year-old college-going self a piece of advice, what would that advice be?
Well, I'm a little bit different. I guess the advice I would give to my 18-year-old self was, go ahead and propose to that girl. I got married at the age of 18, and I'm still married to the same young lady 43 years later. So I would say it has worked out for me. I did not go to college right out of high school. I went and got a job. I worked in a static assembly line, a place called Ramsey Winch, which was here in Tulsa, and I did that for over 2 years. I would recommend that for a lot of people who are not sure if they want to go to college, because it convinced me to go to college. Nothing against that work, but I stood at a bench 8 to 10 hours a day putting gear housings together, and so it made me want to go to school. And so that's another thing I'd say. If I gave myself advice, it would be to decide to go to school early, to listen to my young wife, who kept trying to get me to go to college. But it was almost 3 years before I decided to go to college, and I kept working full-time and went to night school at a school called Tulsa Junior College. And I did that for 2 years, and before I moved on to Northeastern.
And things turned out very well from there, it seems.
Things turned out well. I guess the other advice I would give myself, which you know about, it would be to not eat so many cheeseburgers and pizza, because it almost cost me 2 years ago.
Yeah, well, it's good to have you back, and
Thanks.
glad that things
Yeah.
are going well, and congratulations on Again, From Praha to Prague, published by the University of Oklahoma Press, coming out very, very soon. So find a copy and read it. And you've been listening to the Big Blue Podcast. We want to thank our guest again, Dr. Phil Smith, and we want to thank you for listening. Remember, you can find the podcast every week in the week at TCC and on the Creativity channel on YouTube. Thanks for listening.
Have a great week.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Phil.
all. Appreciate it.